Let's break down every single player that you could possibly need to add off of the waiver wire moving into week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season. And with another week full of injuries, 4 teams on bye week in week 10, you guys are definitely going to want to check out these waiver wire edition. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 10 NFL pick'ems are already starting to go live, and all of their week 9 NFL pick'ems for Monday Night Football are live as well. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL pick'em for either Monday Night Football or Week 10's action. On top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick'em and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, so similar to last week, we don't necessarily have a great week when it comes to the running back position on the waiver wire. So let's take a look at a couple of names that you guys want to check and see if they're available. Let's start with Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys coming in at 72% rostered. And this has been a player that I talked about in the buy low video. This has been a player that I talked about as a solid start throughout the week going into week 9 as well. And just a player who's had double digits in his last 4 starts overall. So a little bit higher rostered. You might not be able to grab Dowdle, but if he is out there, he certainly is the running back to own from a fantasy perspective when it comes to the Cowboys backfield. Who in the world knows what's going on with Ezekiel Elliott, and Dalvin Cook is doing nothing in this offense. And hey, I mean, this offense might be struggling a bit with CeeDee Lamb going down, hamstring injury to Dak Prescott, but somebody's got to get some volume in this offense. And for now, it's Rico Dowdle, who had 21.7 fantasy points in week 9 against the Falcons, 75 yards on the ground, 6 targets, 5 grabs, 32 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. He has 3 receiving touchdowns in his last 4 starts. I don't know what it is, but him and Dak Prescott, good chemistry in the end zone. Nonetheless, it is a tough matchup next week against the Philadelphia Eagles and another tough matchup in week 11 against the Houston Texans, but Rico Dowdle certainly worth rostering if he's available out there in your respective league. Then we got Tyrone Tracy sitting at 78% rostered, who didn't have a great day against the Washington Commanders, just 7.9 fantasy points, but was still pretty efficient running the football at 4.13 yards per carry, 66 rushing yards, and added a reception. Unfortunately, did not find the end zone against the Washington Commanders in week 9. If he had scored a touchdown, this would have been a perfectly fine fantasy stat line. I was expecting big things out of my guy Tyrone Tracy after he cleared concussion protocol. Not a great week 9, but certainly is worth rostering as he is the workhorse running back in that offense as we approach week 10. Now, we got a couple handcuffs. You guys can see if they're available. This is that time in the season where handcuffing your RB1, picking up handcuffs to see if you win kind of the lottery ticket, so to speak, for the week if these injuries keep piling up is definitely important. So Ray Davis, we know what he can do in terms of if James Cook goes down. We saw that back in week 6 against the Jets when Ray Davis had 18.2 fantasy points. He sits at 25% rostered, but we've also seen some nice standalone value out of Ray Davis in the past couple weeks as well. 11.7 fantasy points in week 7, 17 fantasy points against the Miami Dolphins as he had that long receiving touchdown. So I don't know if I would personally be very confident in starting Ray Davis, but hey, he is a great handcuff, and he does have some standalone value. Then we got Justice Hill of the Baltimore Ravens sitting at 33% rostered, another player who sporadically has standalone value, but is obviously a fantastic handcuff because if, God forbid, anything happens to Derrick Henry, which I sure wish does not happen, but if something happens, then Justice Hill comes in as as the next viable running back on this team. But also note that Keaton Mitchell is going to be back in the next coming weeks. We don't really have a timetable for Keaton Mitchell's return. It could be any week at this point. And Keaton Mitchell sits at 13% rostered. Right now, you can throw him on your IR spot as he's still on the PUP list. He's certainly a player worth monitoring in that same sense as well. Then we got Tyler Algier, another running back who does have some standalone value, but is a fantastic handcuff. Once again, God forbid something happens to Bijan Robinson. Algier sits at 47% rostered, 7.8 fantasy points in week 9 against the Cowboys, but he did find the end zone. We've seen a couple weeks here where Tyler Algier has been able to score behind Bijan Robinson as well. So Algier, I think we know, overall what Algier brings to the table, as we've seen him had a 1,000-yard rushing season in his career. So something happens to Bijan, he's going to be plugged in right away in an offense that is certainly clicking at the moment. Then we have Emmanuel Wilson, once again, a handcuff that still has some standalone value, sitting at 8% roster. Now, he's basically done next to nothing this entire season outside of weeks 3 against the Titans and this past week against the Lions, where he did find the end zone and have 9.9 fantasy points. But ultimately, this is an offense that wants to run the football. Something happens to Josh Jacobs, and Emmanuel Wilson will come in as the clear-cut RB1 in this offense. So no real studs emerging on the waiver wire for the running back position here in week 10, but that's a good thing for the most part because, well, that usually means that not a lot of injuries happening at the position. So here's what you guys can take a look at the running back position moving into week 10. To be honest, it's not a very deep week at the wide receiver position either. We're kind of at that point in the season, but we will take a look at players that you can check to see if they're available. I'm not going to break down every single player. You guys can see who's on the screen. Then we'll go over a couple of actual waiver wire additions. But I do want to note if Jawan Jennings is available in your league, coming off of the bye week that the Niners just had, he sits at 60% rostered. Kyle Shanahan has said that Jawan Jennings should return in week 10. And I think Jennings should be a priority pickup as he's going to face the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a defense that has really struggled, has given up a lot of points to the wide receiver position on the season. Jennings should be a solid add, especially with Deebo Samuel dealing with some injury in week 8 as well. So go out, see if Jennings is available. I like him. I mean, all these names under that category, I like. A lot of them really highly rostered. Those Browns wide receivers might be floating around if you're lucky. But the other player that I do want to note, make sure you guys have checked if he's available, is Jameson Williams. I was kind of surprised to see a lot of people just say, he's suspended 2 games. I'm done. I'm dropping him. Also, I think the goose egg in week 7 or the 0.6 fantasy points was part of that too, combination of those two things. But if Williams got dropped in your league, don't forget Jameson Williams was the wide receiver 15 going into week 7. Had double digits in every game except for week 3 so far on the season. It's a strong schedule here as he's going to face the Texans in week 10 and the Jags in week 11. So if he's out there, he should be your priority add. But everyone else there in that category worth adding. Just don't know if they're going to be available for you guys. But let's talk about Quentin Johnston, who we talked about going into week 9 in the sneaky starts video. And this was a player that I also talked about in the last minute waiver wire video going into the week as well. He sits at 27% rostered, 5 targets, 4 catches, 118 receiving yards, 8 tutty, and 22 fantasy points. So he had the best fantasy outing out of any Chargers wide receiver. Ladd McConkey, still a solid day with 11.4 fantasy points. Then Josh Palmer, not a bad day either at 14.3 fantasy points. He also found the end zone. He's also a player that we could consider adding off the waiver wire as he sits at 17% rostered. But I've liked Quentin Johnston throughout the season. He's shown good, consistent red zone chemistry with Justin Herbert. Through the first 4 weeks of the season, he had 3 touchdowns. Bad game against Denver, as expected in week 6, bye week in between there. Then he missed week 7 and week 8. Then in his return against a very soft secondary in the Cleveland Browns, Quentin Johnston shined again, and Justin Herbert is throwing the football more. Thank goodness we're not seeing such a one-dimensional Chargers offense. Threw the football 27 times this past week, which is not that high, but 32 times in week 8, 39 in week 7, 34 in week 6, and ultimately those numbers are much higher than what we got, generally speaking, through the first couple weeks of the season. And overall, the passing yard total has gone way up. Through the first 4 games of the season, Herbert did not throw for more than 179 passing yards. In his last 4 games, he's thrown for 237 or more passing yards. So I do like Quentin Johnston, but we might have a little bit of wealth to spread around amongst those Chargers wide receivers. Now, Jalen Tolbert comes in here. This is a player who I do want to proceed with a little bit of caution with, because you guys know that I was high on Jalen Tolbert early in the season, but we've got the injury to CeeDee Lamb. It's an AC joint issue. He's going to undergo an MRI. I still kind of prefer a healthy CeeDee Lamb if we're going to chase Jalen Tolbert, but at the end of the day, if CeeDee Lamb is going to miss some time, and that's going to mean more targets for Jalen Tolbert at the end of the day, who had 10.9 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 grabs, 19 receiving yards, and a touchdown. But 2 solid matchups coming up here against the Eagles, who ultimately, that defense is looking better, but they're still giving up a lot of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Then week 11 against the Texans, who have a trash secondary. So Tolbert's definitely been hard to trust. He has 3 other double-digit fantasy performances on the season, but he's worth adding, especially if we're going to see more volume go his way. Then we got Demarcus Robinson, a player that we talked about a lot going into this week as well. Talked about him in both waiver wire videos, or early in the last minute waiver wire video going into week 9. He had 27.4 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 grabs, 94 receiving yards, and 2 tutties. It's a tough matchup in week 10 against the Miami Dolphins, but Demarcus Robinson really benefits from the fact that Puka Nacua, as long as he's not throwing punches, and Cooper Kupp are on the field in front of him, and that makes for defenses to have to apply pressure to both of those guys. So going into week 10, even though it's a tough matchup against Miami, we should have a healthy Cooper Kupp, a healthy Puka Nacua, who's not going to disappear and then throw a punch and get ejected. And that should be good for Demarcus Robinson, even in a tough matchup. But in the last 2 weeks, Demarcus Robinson has 4 touchdowns, and he's always, in my opinion, was supposed to be the wide receiver 3 on this team, not Tutu Atwell or Jordan Whittington or any of these other guys that have come up throughout the season. And he has been definitely looking consistent since we've had Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua return. So Demarcus Robinson in a Rams offense is throwing the football a lot more. The offensive line looks a lot better. Matthew Stafford looks far more comfortable, throwing 6 touchdowns in his last 2 games. He should be a priority add. He's going to be an option in the flex, especially as we're dealing with all these bye weeks here in week 10. Then we got Noah Brown sitting at 5% rostered. Kind of easy to X him out going into week 9 in terms of waivers, because he got the Hail Mary, which led to 16.3 fantasy points. But this past week, 6 targets, 5 catches, 60 receiving yards. It's the Steelers, the Eagles, and the Cowboys in the next coming weeks. These should be good competitive matchups. And I've said it all season long. Somebody's got to step up here as a pass catcher on this team outside of Scary Terry, who had 2 touchdowns and 15.9 fantasy points this past week. Somebody's got to step up over the course of the season the way that the Commanders are playing. So, small sample size here, 2 double-digit games in a row, not a whole lot outside of that on the season. But still, if somebody's going to step up, we want to jump on that as soon as possible, because this offense continues to look very good. So Noah Brown sits at 5% rostered. He's a deep option for you guys. The Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, we talked about him in this Sneaky Starts video going into week 9. He has a touchdown in 4 straight games now. His best performance of the season in week 9 against the Patriots. 6 targets, 5 grabs, 50 receiving yards, and that touchdown. This is a player who has a bad matchup this week against the Chargers, but if we continue to see that injury to Tyler Boyd persist, and even if we don't, we continue to see some targets for Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. So this one still holds risk, and I'm excited that it worked out this past week, although I don't know if anyone really watched the Sneaky Starts video and said, you know what, I am going to start Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. I even said in the video, like, this is a deep play. But nonetheless, it's a bad matchup this week against the Chargers. Still, he is an option with the bye weeks, the injuries, all that stuff, if you need somebody to potentially plug in going into week 10. All right, the good news is if your quarterback is on bye week, we have a ton of quarterback options on the waiver wire going into week 10. So let's kick it off with Matthew Stafford, who finished with 18.9 fantasy points in week 9, threw for 298 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, a pick. It looks so much better with those receivers healthy. I know Puka Nacua wasn't a factor, as we've discussed, but ultimately, with at least Cooper Kupp on the field, Demarcus Robinson playing well, all that stuff. Overtime win this past week for the Rams, 2 wins straight in a row. They're going to make this matchup against the Dolphins in week 10 competitive. Stafford sits at 57% rostered. He is certainly an option. Been a little bit worried about my guy Kirko Chains, but he had another solid fantasy outing this past week. 17.7 fantasy points, 19 of 24, 222 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns against an awful Cowboys defense. Now he gets the Saints on the road here. I do like this matchup for Kirko Chains. The last time he played the Saints, he only had 8.5 fantasy points. The reason why I've been worried about aggressively going after Kirk Cousins is because he has the 2 big games against Tampa Bay, a 17.5 fantasy day against Philly, and now a second 17.7 fantasy day against the Cowboys. Outside of that, it has not been good, 12.5 or less fantasy points, but the Saints defense doesn't really scare me. Kirk Cousins is certainly an option. Now, Geno Smith will be on bye week this week in week 10, but he had a big day against the Rams defense with 25 fantasy points, 363 passing yards, 3 tutties. He did throw 3 picks as well. Geno, just one of these guys I feel like is worth mentioning because the numbers have been there. It hasn't really been pretty. And as soon as you want to pick him up and start him because he has a good game, then he has a bad game the next week. So I don't know. He's a QB 11 in fantasy. He is on bye this week, so I don't know that you really need to jump the gun there, but he's certainly an option. Now, I talked about Aaron Rodgers as a solid streaming option going into week 9 against the Texans defense, who have struggled against opposing quarterbacks and opposing wide receivers. Thursday Night Football, he was 22 of 32, 211 in passing yards, and 3 passing tutties. 20 fantasy points. He's the QB 9 in fantasy at the time I'm recording this. So Rodgers against the Cardinals this week is certainly a streaming option if you need help. Then we got Tua Time himself, who I was a little worried going up against the Bills. Like, what's the ceiling here? And the ceiling wasn't crazy high by any stretch, as he only had 17.5 fantasy points, but he looked pretty good. I mean, 25 of 28, 231 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns, and it's a very solid matchup this week in week 10 for Tua going up against the Rams, who Geno Smith just balled out against, like we discussed. So he's definitely an option if you need some help at the quarterback position. Now, I was maybe a little bit aggressively too high on Bo Nix going into week 9, but, going into week 8, Bo Nix was my guy as well, my top streaming option at quarterback, as we discussed in a couple of videos, and he had 29 fantasy points, so I was super excited about him in that matchup against the Ravens, who were giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback position going into week 9, and he still had a solid day, 18.7 fantasy points, 19 of 33, 223 passing yards. He did throw his first pick since week 6 of the season. Still, he's only thrown 2 picks since week 3 of the season, 36 yards on the ground, and he caught a touchdown from Cortland Sutton. So, I mean, really, I guess an okay day. It wasn't a great day. He didn't throw any touchdowns, It is a tough matchup here in week 10 against the Kansas City Chiefs, but Nix is an option if you're a little bit depleted and the options out there are thin. Now, Justin Herbert, we mentioned him earlier in the video. 19.4 fantasy points in week 9 against the Browns. 18 of 27, 282 passing yards, 2 tutties. And he had 2 tutties in week 8 as well, and 279 passing yards. So he now has 19.4 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games. He gets the Titans, who don't really scare me this week. Something about Herbert, I still feel like the ceiling is a bit capped, but he's certainly an option sitting at 46% rostered if you need some help at the gunslinging position. All right, let's move along to tight end. And Cade Otton, at the time of recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played. I have to record these during Sunday Night Football. So he's still the tight end 8 on the season. He's been fantastic. He's a smash matchup against the Chiefs on Monday Night Football, who are giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the tight end position. If he's out there, he sits at 82% rostered. He should be picked up, even in a stiffer matchup going into week 10. But Otton should be rostered like 100% of leagues, is my opinion. All right, Hunter Henry. I kind of briefly mentioned this in Sunday morning's video. Henry is the one guy who's going to almost certainly benefit from Drake May starting at the quarterback position. Him and Drake May just got a little bromance on the field. 8 targets for Henry, 7 catches, 56 receiving yards, 12.6 fantasy points. Tough matchup against the Bears in week 10, but Hunter Henry is back on the streaming radar as long as Jacoby Brissett is not the starting quarterback and Drake May is the starting quarterback. All right, Taysom Hill, I don't know why his name is blue. It should coordinate to his team, but Taysom Hill's name is in blue, whatever. I'm not going to change it. Listen, 16 fantasy points in week 9. All the Taysom Hill truthers can unite. You're able to stream him this week. He showed out. 5 targets, 4 catches, 41 receiving yards, rushed for 19 total yards, and a touchdown. And this is probably going to be another good situation in week 10 against the Falcons. The last time the Saints played the Falcons, Taysom Hill had 14.4 fantasy points. So with all these injuries on this roster, Taysom Hill continues to be an option, okay? Obviously, Alvin Kamara had a big day this past week, but they're going to continue to get Taysom Hill involved, especially with Chris Olave suffering that awful-looking concussion in Week 9 as well. So Taysom Hill sits at 31% rostered. He is certainly a viable option at the tight end position. Then we got my guy Mike Gesicki. I don't know why Mike Gesicki's name is green. Jeez. Anyways, he had 27 fantasy points. We talked about this in Sunday morning's video going into Week 9 as well. 6 targets, 5 grabs, 100 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. Was not expecting this high of a ceiling for Gesicki. And I will say, going into Week 10, I like him again because it's a good matchup against the Ravens, who have struggled against opposing tight ends. But part of the reason why I like Gesicki a lot going into Week 9 was because of the expected absence of T. Higgins. And then we ended up having Jermaine Burton as a healthy scratch. Then we saw no Zach Moss as well at the running back position. So I certainly liked Chase Brown a lot going into the week, but I also liked Mike Gesicki in this offense going into the week. So the point that I'm trying to make, long-winded here, is that we're going to have to see who's injured, who's not going into Week 10. T. Higgins' absence really elevates the play of Mike Gesicki and the targets that he gets. So that's going to be a factor, but regardless, it is a good matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. Johnny Smith coming in at 9% rostered. He had 9.6 fantasy points in Week 9, 6 targets, 5 grabs, 46 receiving yards. Not a crazy high ceiling, but it has been nice to see him get involved or stay involved with the return of Tua Tagovailoa at quarterback, as he was really starting to get going in the absence of Tua at quarterback and Tyler Huntley at quarterback. But even with us seeing Tyreek Hill getting more involved, and I don't really want to say Jalen Waddle, but in theory, Jalen Waddle more involved, Devon Achane more effective. Johnny Smith has still at least had 6 targets in the last 2 games and has been part of this offense. He's a guy who at worst is going to get you some points. And then we got Theo Johnson, rookie for the New York Giants, who had 14.1 fantasy points in Week 9, sits at 5% rostered. He had a nice touchdown in this game, 6 targets, 3 catches, 51 receiving yards. He has 6 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 5, except for Week 7 against Philly, where he did nothing, had no targets in that game. But the whole offense was a disaster that week. Regardless, nice involvement this past week, scored the touchdown. You take away the touchdown, not a great day by any means, right? But the Giants will play the Carolina Panthers in Week 10. It's a smash matchup. The Panthers have been awful against opposing tight ends all season long. So if you're dealing with a ton of injuries, you're dealing with all the bye weeks, you're in need of a deep sleeper streaming option at tight end, Theo Johnson against the Panthers may just be your guy. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every player that you guys can try to grab off of the waiver wire moving into Week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season. I can't believe we're this far into the season already. We've made it to the double-digit mark, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget, guys, I will answer every single comment on this video. So if you guys need anything whatsoever going into Monday Night Football or going into Week 10 of the season, drop me a comment. I'll get every comment on this video answered. And don't forget, guys, as the week goes on, we're going to have everything you guys could possibly need here on the channel to help you guys dominate Week 10 of the season. Start sits at every position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, buy low options, players that you can't bench, sneaky starts, last minute waiver additions, fantasy Q&A live streams throughout the week, everything that you guys could possibly need. So most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.